Living in Albuquerque, it's easy to take for granted the natural beauty, the access to wilderness, and the meandering calm of the Rio Grande. Live here long enough and we can even become jaded by the view of the Sandia Mountains from our kitchen windows. Fortunately for today's residents, there were some who never took it for granted. In 1982, the City Council created the Open Space Trust Fund. 2 years later, it established the Open Space Division within the Parks and Recreation Department, formally cementing its commitment to providing its citizens with recreational opportunities, encounters with nature, and a bit of solitude. It was the culmination of a process that has resulted in Albuquerque possessing more parkland per person than any city in the United States, leaving Duke City residents with plenty of room to roam. While political will and citizen activism won the battle to preserve lands for the benefit of all, the fact is the concept of communal land is part of Albuquerque's fabric, stretching back thousands of years to the area's first inhabitants. It continued through the time of Spanish colonial settlers and into the early 20th century when park ranger and one-time Albuquerque resident Aldo Leopold launched what would eventually become the modern environmental movement. Environmental activism of the 1960s and 1970s would bring the issue to resolution. The Aboriginal peoples who populated the Rio Grande Valley and surrounding areas as far back as 12,000 years ago would not have had any conception of a parcel of land set aside as open space. The landscape was a source of survival for the Paleo-Indian inhabitants. They hunted everything from mastodons to rabbits and gathered local plants, grasses, and nuts. They camped near seasonal lakes or playas on top of the West Mesa to be near water. Life was fluid and property communal. Native Americans saw themselves as part of the ecosystem. The real test of living was to establish a harmonious relationship with nature, to see it as the source of one's life and livelihood, and the source of one's essential well-being. The Spanish settlers who colonized New Mexico brought with them a tradition of communal land use that manifested in the form of land grants, typically awarded as compensation for service to the king in settling the new territories. There were 14 Spanish land grants in the Albuquerque area dating from the time of Juan de Oñate's entry into New Mexico in 1598. They extend from Carnihuel on the east to Atrisco on the west, to Pajarito on the south, and Alameda on the north. Although the grant lands were usually divided among settlers, some portion was set aside for community use. Because the survival of the settlers was paramount, one of the requirements was that the land grants had access to water, wood, and a grazing area, the building blocks of the agricultural society that dominated the area for generations. Hispanics still speak of querencia, a place where one feels safe, a place from which one draws strength of character. It also implies a sense of responsibility to the land. Perhaps the most well-known land grant in Albuquerque, the Elena Gallegos grant, was originally gifted to Diego Montoya, who had returned to New Mexico in 1693 to subdue the revolt and reclaim the territory for Spain. The original grant ran from the Rio Grande to the Sandia Mountains and from what is today Montgomery Boulevard north to Sandia Pueblo. Elena Gallegos was born in Bernalillo about the time of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Her family fled south after the revolt. Elena returned to the area in 1693 and at age 19 married adventurer Santiago Gurule. Santiago died in 1711, but the enterprising widow continued the family business, raising livestock. In 1716, Diego Montoya or his son sold or bequeathed the 35,000-plus acre grant to Elena. After her death, the grant passed to her son, and after he died, it was parceled out among heirs. Some of the lands were sold, but the portion on the East Mesa and in the mountains was held and used in common. The heirs eventually lost the land due to unpaid taxes, however, and in 1934, Albuquerque rancher and Congressman Albert Sins bought a large portion of the land grant. When he died in 1964, he willed it to the Albuquerque Academy. The story of Elena Gallegos would have one more important chapter, however. Today, the legacy of the land grants is still apparent. Los Poblanos open space sits on a part of the original Elena Gallegos grant. A portion of the Petroglyph National Park lies on parts of the former Atrisco and Alameda land grants. Cottonwood Mall and the village of Corrales were built on sections of the original Alameda grant. In 1909, Aldo Leopold arrived in Albuquerque to take a position with the U.S. Forest Service office. His first assignment took him to Arizona's Apache National Forest. 2 years later, he took a position as deputy supervisor of the Carson National Forest north of Santa Fe. It was here that Leopold first learned how man, nature, and animals could all be accommodated on public lands. Leopold returned to Albuquerque in 1914 to work at the Office of Grazing and settled here with his wife Estelle. In 1917, Leopold took leave from the Forest Service to work for the Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce, hoping to change the perception of the growing city. Albuquerque's greatest defect, he believed, was that it was just like every other Western city of its size. Despite centuries of history and tradition, the city made little effort to preserve its distinctive culture and natural setting. That same year, Leopold proposed a river park along the Rio Grande. He told an audience, "The average Albuquerque man, woman, or child is in need of a place within walking distance of the city where he can enjoy a breath of fresh air and a sight of a few trees, a few birds, and a little water." Leopold's practical side was backed by a deeply thought-out philosophy that in some ways harkened back to Native Americans. Leopold saw man's purpose as one of maintaining a balance in the environment and viewed the earth as an animate object. Leopold moved to Wisconsin in 1924, but he proved to be visionary. His idea for a river park became a reality when the Rio Grande Valley State Park was established in 1983. From his strong belief in the health of the land and its benefit to people, Leopold was able to generate a new land ethic. Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the nation owe a great debt to his far-sighted words and deeds. Whether crowned by a cloudy mist or reflecting its signature pink light, the Sandia Mountains dominate the view eastward from any point in Albuquerque. At the base of the mountains, scores of hiking trails weave their way from the city's edges into the national forest. To the west, volcanic cones still catch the eye atop the escarpment formed more than 120,000 years ago. In both cases, we take the unobstructed views for granted. But without the foresight of open space advocates, the views and the access to wilderness might have been blighted by the sight of rooftops. Though the preservation of both sites came about by different processes, the battles to protect them from development resulted in the open space we have today. Practically since Albuquerque incorporated in 1892, the city faced land development pressures, and for the most part, the political and civic leaders encouraged unfettered construction. But the sentiment for preserving open spaces within the urban environment did not die after Aldo Leopold left town in 1924. Clyde Tingley, chairman of the City Commission and unofficial mayor of Albuquerque, was certainly influenced by Leopold, and during his second stint on the commission, beginning in 1939, he worked to develop the city's park system. By 1948, the city's Public Works Department oversaw 21 parks and recreation areas. The number of parks and amount of open space grew rapidly after the city formed the Parks and Recreation Department in 1954 and appointed Bob Bergen as director. One of Bergen's first tasks was to get the park dedication ordinance passed, which required homebuilders to dedicate land to the city for each new subdivision built. But it was his efforts in seeking land from the federal government for large regional parks that laid the groundwork for the open space program as we know it today. By the mid-70s, Bergen procured approximately 9,000 acres, including Montesa Park, Gutierrez Canyon, San Antonito, Placitas, Boca Negra, and the shooting range grasslands. Bergen's efforts coincide with a change in attitudes. By the late 1960s, environmentalists, planners, civic leaders, and enlightened politicians began to hold views counter to the city's traditional development perspective. The year 1969 marked the beginning of today's open space program. The City-County Goals Commission agreed to preserve the unique natural features of the metropolitan area by achieving a pattern of development and open space respecting the river, land, mesa, mountains, volcanoes, and arroyos. Citizens groups formed to watch over each element of the city's open space. In 1975, Philip Tollefsrud brought the groups together under the banner of the Open Space Task Force. That same year, the newly published City-County Comprehensive Plan called for acquisition or public control of the major features of the natural landscape. During the decade of the 1970s, the city successfully acquired land on the volcanic escarpment and in the Sandia foothills and a nature preserve adjacent to the Rio Grande. From 1973 to 1983, Albuquerque voters supported every local bond issue for open space acquisition. At first reluctant to back open space initiatives, two-term Mayor Harry Kinney soon became an outspoken proponent. Some of the greatest open space milestones were achieved under Kinney's administrations, including the purchases of the volcanoes, the Rio Grande Valley State Park, and the Elena Gallegos land grant. From the early 1970s, open space advocates had coveted the historic Elena Gallegos grant, a section that formed 1/4 of the city's Sandia Mountain backdrop. In 1980, talks about developing the land prompted the city to take out an option to buy the property, but a search for $26 million in federal funding proved fruitless. Fortunately, City Councilor Robert White had been working with the Open Space Task Force to come up with a solution, and in 1982, he drafted a bill to authorize a 1/4-cent tax for the purchase of open space. While White worked with the council to produce an acceptable version of the bill, the task force gathered some 15,000 signatures, urging the council to pass the 1/4-cent tax. A few months later, the council voted overwhelmingly in favor of the tax. The city completed the transaction in 1982, keeping 640 acres for the Elena Gallegos picnic area and Albert G. Sims Park, and trading more than 7,000 acres of the land grant to the U.S. Forest Service for surplus federal lands. The city sold the surplus lands and placed the proceeds in a permanent trust fund for open space management. The 7,000 acres in the foothills, now known as the Sandia Mountain Wilderness, became off-limits to development. In 1984, the city created the Open Space Division of the Parks and Recreation Department and appointed Rex Funk as its director. The Open Space Division could now focus on proper management and maintenance of open space lands. Citizens would face another critical challenge by the late 1980s as development encroached upon the escarpment and petroglyphs on Albuquerque's west side. The escarpment had long been recognized as a sacred place, and generations of Native Americans and Hispanic settlers commemorated that reality with a multitude of rock carvings. But developers and homeowners both had a stake in continued development. They filed numerous lawsuits against the city, but it successfully fended them off until the city council could pass a land use plan for the area in 1989. U.S. Senators Pete Domenici and Jeff Bingaman then initiated legislation to form the Petroglyph National Monument in 1990. Albuquerque residents and civic leaders continued to show their support for open space in the 1990s. In 1997, voters approved a quarter-cent tax increase that was in effect from 1998 to 2000. The tax raised approximately $36 million to purchase more than 2,000 acres of land proposed as major public open space, including Los Poblanos Fields and Tres Pistolas. In 2006, the city dedicated the Open Space Visitor Center on Albuquerque's west side. As the city grows, so does the need for open space. Massive developments expected at Mesa del Sol south of Albuquerque and on the old Atrisco land grant in the southwest will present huge open space needs. If open space does not grow as the population grows, it gets overused and deteriorates, notes Open Space Superintendent Matt Schmader. We currently have one of the best ratios of land per capita, but unfortunately, that makes people feel satisfied. They don't realize that what we have now will not be here in the future without conservation efforts and the efforts to preserve more land for the common good. Schmader said the message that needs to get out is that conservation is good for the community. Development is like overeating. Conservation is like exercise. Schmader frames the narrative as a love story between the people and the land, and maintains that our sense of place has been shaped by how people acted out that love story. It's like a long marriage. Maybe it's been good for 30 years, but what's going to keep us together for the next 20?